Quote, a writer in the act of writing must fear neither his own words nor anything else in the world. A writer who is afraid is no true writer. End quote. This portrays Kuhn's modernist writing style encouraged during the Nazi era. Kuhn's modernist writing style is expressed in most of her novels that were written and published in the early 1930s. These novels depict the sex lives, career struggles, and alienation of young urban women in Germany during World War I and World War II. These depictions are descriptions of what Kuhn actually experienced and saw through her whole life growing up in Berlin. I may not know if Kuhn was ever afraid when she published her novels, but there is one thing that I am certain of, and that is that she was very courageous. Kuhn achieved early success in Germany, and that her success grew towards other parts of the world. However, her works were stripped away from her by the Nazis, who were not as impressed by her radical modernistic novels. That is when her novels were withdrawn from circulation and publicly burned. However, that didn't stop her from writing After Midnight. The novel is based on a young German woman's feelings of alienation, fear, loss of self, and courage she expresses because of the era's politics. Kuhn's style of writing and portrayal of main character Suzanne expresses the alienation, self-loss, and courage that young German people experienced during the Nazi era in the 1920s and 1930s. Due to the new regulations enforced by Hitler's politics, many of the young German men and women had to follow the rules, even if they thought the regulations were confusing or absurd. To illustrate this, in the beginning of the novel, Suzanne starts by saying, "I don't want to do any more thinking. In fact, I can't do any more thinking. My brain's so full of light and darkness, circling in confusion." The idea of confusion and not being able to distinguish what is right and what is wrong exemplifies the absurdity of the era's politics. This illustrates how it negatively affects the young minds of individuals like Suzanne. Suzanne believes this confusion isolates her from understanding others because of the era's politics, thus causing her to feel alienated from her own country. This alienation is also caused by the fear that if people like Suzanne do not act like right-thinking people, on account of the world outlook and government, then they will be classified as criminals. Kuhn illustrates the feeling of fear and alienation when Suzanne listens to a furious speech of the new era of Nazism and regulations. Quote, "My heart always stands still when I hear the speeches, because how do I know I am not one of the sort who are going to be smashed? And the worst of it is that I just don't understand what is really going on. I'm only gradually getting the hang of the things that you must be, not to do." End quote. In other words, Suzanne is afraid that if she says or does the wrong thing, then she will be sent to jail or be placed in a mental hospital for treatment, thus causing her to lose her own voice. One of the main reasons why it must be difficult for Suzanne to have this feeling of alienation in a country that deprives her from speaking her own mind. The alienation that the main character felt can also be explained by the inner depression Suzanne experienced during the beginnings of the era of Nazism. This caused her to lose a sense of herself by making her give up on her own beliefs in order to conform to this changing society reigned by politics. This idea of inner depression and self-loss can be explained when Suzanne lived in Cologne with her aunt and made a few friends who always made fun of Franz. In order to fit in with the group, Suzanne started making cruel jokes about Franz as well. Quote, "I went along with them over Franz, making even nastier jokes about him. I felt proud when they laughed at my jokes, but I was ashamed of myself too. I used to feel sad and disgusted." End quote. If Suzanne didn't comply with the others, she would have felt alienated from the group. She would have felt like a foreigner because she knew she didn't want to follow them, so at that time she decided to take the easy way out and left her own beliefs and values out of fear. This feeling of self-loss is something that many people in this modern era experience too, because nobody wants to feel like they don't belong. The only way to not feel alienated is to give up on your own values or beliefs out of fear of being alone, just like Suzanne. Kuhn likes to portray this self-loss in most of her novels through the main characters. Everything that Suzanne experienced in Cologne is a sense of self-loss and depression, as explained by Kristeva. Intriguingly, depressed persons are as likely to give up speech as they are to talk incessantly. But as Kristeva points out, even those depressed patients who speak continuously experience constantly the disjunction between self and other and signification. In other words, even though one may speak clearly and continuously, they can still experience a constant disconnection between themselves and other, and a loss of meaning on themselves and life. Kristeva also mentioned that people who are usually depressed tend to want and require more affection and reliance from others, which can be very draining to the other person, thus causing them to have depression as well. For instance, Kuhn portrayed Franz as a lost, depressed individual who relied on Suzanne a lot, thus causing his feelings of nothingness change over time. However, this pressure that Franz and the Nazi politics put on Suzanne caused her to become depressed as well. Yet, Suzanne ended up meeting and relying on Franz more, because his love made things much easier for her to comprehend everything around her without having to lose herself in depression much longer. However, there were still laws intact that Suzanne and other German people had to follow. If they refused the laws, then they would not only be classified as just criminals, but they will also be sent to the concentration camps for their radical and questioning behavior. This fear and alienation became more clear to Suzanne when her aunt Adelheid denounced her to the Gestapo for criticizing one of the Germans' Göring's speeches and the Führer. Although she was afraid of the Gestapo, she decided to leave to Frankfurt, thus showing us her courage to live and to uphold her own beliefs, even if it isolates her from society and from those who embrace Hitler. According to Birgit Meyer-Katkin, using the internal position between self and other, she creates a literary image of stranger to oneself. Suzanne not only notices the foreigner in herself, but also realizes that being alienated from herself, however painful that may be, provides her with that exquisite distance within herself and others. In other words, Suzanne is aware that she is different than her aunt Adelheid and Pielman. She is also aware that she is different from her own facade that she tried to create in order to feel a sense of belonging. Even though being aware of this difference is painful, it still provides her with the opportunity to view herself in the face of the other, thus giving her a better understanding of the struggles and choices people had to make in order to keep living in this political reign of Nazism. In spite of this, some may say that her inability to comprehend or conform could have been caused by her young rebellious mentality. There was one section in the book where Suzanne encountered the Sturmerman, who claimed to have invented a tool that would differentiate Jews and Christians. The Sturman classified Suzanne for being too rebellious as a young woman to understand that signs of the zodiac do not apply to Jews. In other words, being young and a woman meant that Suzanne is too ignorant and rebellious to understand the difference between Jews and Christians, and as a German woman she should keep her thoughts to herself. This goes back to the era of Nazism and the role that women played during this time. According to Jonathan Mock, a scholar in Western Oregon University, said, Hitler and other Nazi leaders like Goebbels and Kuhn viewed women as separate entities from men in their own right, and that women had a certain place in society. For instance, women as a housewife and mother. In other words, women in Germany during the Nazi era were seen as nothing more than just simple domestic servants of men. Kuhn clearly portrayed this marginalization and alienation of women in both of her modernistic novels, Gilgi and Artificial Silk Girl. In the novel Artificial Silk Girl, the main character Doris feels alienated from other women because she doesn't have the same amount of money or class. Doris feels that if she at least had an education, it will make her more striking for men that have an upper socioeconomic status. Suzanne has the same dilemma where she feels that she is not worthy to be the assistant secretary's wife because she doesn't have a dowry and property. I believe both characters feel this unfairness to subject themselves to a certain being because society and the politics in Germany portray women as only housewives, especially those who don't have a high socioeconomic status. This ideology may have been the main cause as to why Suzanne felt more alienated and ended up losing herself by trying to accommodate with the German Nazi culture. Plus, Suzanne had an education, and at that time it was looked down upon, since women were not meant to have an education, thus making Suzanne feel more like a foreigner in her own culture and society. Eventually, Suzanne's perception does change when she decides to go into exile, because she didn't want to end up like her brother Algin, who gave up his values and beliefs for Nazism, or like Heine, who decided to commit suicide before giving in to Nazism. Suzanne's decisions of going into exile may have been depicted by Kuhn's own feelings and motives, since Kuhn wrote After Midnight when she had fled Berlin. Plus, I believe Kuhn portrays her own relief and courage through Suzanne. Quote, "We have left the fear behind. That was the border all right, France. I am happy. We are safer. We will live." End quote. It is important to note that the fear and alienation Suzanne felt actually encouraged her to make a very courageous decision. What Suzanne did was considered radical during the era of Nazism because her actions were a portrayal of political treason towards the Nazi government. Yet one can argue that in this modern era Suzanne's actions are just justified because she was courageous and she accepted herself another, even if that isolated her from her own culture and country. Now, I would like to end this with a quote that I believe lies deep within Suzanne's and Kuhn's sense of hope. Quote, "We'll sleep now. We shall need strength when we wake up. There are still stars shining behind the misty clouds. Please, God, let there be a little sunlight tomorrow." End quote.